Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are talking about lab lesson number 9 related to the brain and the bones and muscles of the head. When we talk about the brain, the part of the brain that you normally think of as the brain is a part known as the cerebrum. So what we're looking at on the screen here is the entire brain, but the cerebrum is all of the pink stuff that we see here on the top. Down below it, and we'll talk a little more about this, is a smaller part called the cerebellum. But the cerebrum is the big part on top. So when we talk about the cerebrum, it has 5 lobes, and the lobes of the cerebrum will match up very nicely with the regional terms that you learned. So in the very front of the brain, by that frontal bone, we have the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. The frontal lobe of the cerebrum is where your personality comes from. It's where your decision-making and planning and all of the stuff that makes you human happens. The frontal lobe is also where all of your motor activities come from. When you decide to do a movement, it started in the frontal lobe. Next, we go to a lobe called the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is the lobe of the brain that's all about sensory information. So when you feel something, when you are touching something, those kinds of sensations are all processed here in the parietal lobe. In the very back, toward the very bottom, we have what's called the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe, like the occipital region. The occipital lobe is involved in vision and also storing your visual memories. So it's kind of ironic to me that the part of the brain that does vision is in the very opposite of where the eyes are located, the occipital lobe in the back. The last lobe we can see on the outside is called the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe. This lobe is primarily responsible for the sense of hearing, since it's right next to the ear. But this lobe also helps you out with the sense of smell, the temporal lobe. If I were to cut away a little piece of the frontal lobe and a little piece of the parietal lobe, a little bit of this temporal lobe, if I took all of those away and looked deep, I would see one other lobe that we have in the brain, and that's called the insula. So the insula is the innermost lobe that we have in the brain. It's not seen on the surface. This one's really important for the sense of taste, the insula. So 5 different lobes of the brain. Make sure we're aware of their general locations. I'll mention too on the homework assignment, when it asks you to click on one of these lobes, do yourself a favor and don't click by the very edge of one of them, because you're more likely to be right on the border. So if I'm looking for the frontal lobe, if I click right here in the middle of it, I'm going to get those points. Or the parietal lobe right here in the middle of it. If I'm clicking down here where I'm like in the middle of the parietal and the occipital lobes, I may not get credit for that. So try to find the best region for that lobe in the brain. In addition to knowing the lobes of the brain, there's a couple of special other features you need to know. So we're looking at a brain now that's flipped the opposite direction that it was before. So now we can see the frontal lobe is over on this side of the brain compared to where it was last time. We can see the parietal lobe back here in this dark blue color. We've got that temporal lobe on the side and a little bit of the occipital lobe that we can see back there. What this model is really great for showing me, though, is a couple of the bumps that we have in the brain. So my anatomy word for a bump that I have on the brain is a gyrus. I just put that in the chat. So a gyrus is a bump, a raised portion in the brain. Having these bumps gives us more surface area in the brain, so it allows us to have more neurons to do more processing. In between these 2 bumps, and we'll talk about their name in a moment, in between them there is an indentation. So an indentation is called a sulcus. So this indentation that we see here between the red bump and the blue bump, this is called the central sulcus. The central sulcus, because it's in the middle of the brain. The central sulcus divides up the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, but the other thing it does is it divides up the motor part of the brain, which is the frontal lobe, from the sensory parts of the brain, which is everything else. So the central sulcus divides up the brain functionally, as well as dividing up those lobes. In front of the central sulcus, we have what's called the pre-central gyrus. The pre-central gyrus. Pre means before. So the pre-central gyrus before the central sulcus, the post-central gyrus after the central sulcus. If I'm going to ask you about the pre-central or post-central gyrus, I'm going to use this model that's color-coded because it's the easiest for you to see. I will mention on the picture of the brain that we were looking at before, so if we bounce back here, you can actually see it pretty clearly, the central sulcus, so this line that we see here, and we can see those two bumps, but not all of my models have a very clear central sulcus. So again, if I'm going to ask you about that, I'm going to ask you about it on my color-coded model, where we can very distinctly see the difference between the precentral and postcentral gyrus. The other dividing line for us to be aware of in the brain is the line that divides the left half from the right half. This is something called the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure. This divides the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. The two hemispheres in your brain generally have the same kinds of functional capabilities, but some tasks are better done in the left side versus the right side, which is why you'll hear people talk about, oh, I'm just so left-brained, I'm really good at math, or I'm just so right-brained, I'm really good at art. That's what we're talking about with those hemispheres, the left and the right hemispheres. That are divided from each other using that longitudinal fissure. Down below the cerebrum, we have that thing called the cerebellum. The cerebellum, in a lot of ways, is like a little cerebrum. So its name kind of looks like that. Cerebellum, the little cerebrum. So ways that it's similar to the cerebrum, we have two hemispheres or two halves of the cerebellum. Connecting those two hemispheres together, we have this little thing right here, I'm circling it. Its name is the vermis, and this word vermis actually literally means worm. So we've got this little worm-looking structure that connects the two halves of the cerebellum to each other. If I look inside the cerebellum, I can see this pattern, this white pattern that I see in here, kind of looks like a tree. That is called the arbor vitae. Arbor vitae, that's the tree of life. In the brain, we have gray matter and white matter, and we'll talk about this more in lecture coming soon. But gray matter and white matter have different kinds of, or different amounts of myelin in them. So white matter has a lot of myelin, which means it's going to have those parts of the neuron called the axon, where I send information away. Gray matter doesn't have as much myelin, which is why it looks gray. That's going to have things like cell bodies of our neurons, so it's really good at processing. So the arbor vitae is the white matter that we see inside the cerebellum. When we talk about the cerebellum, even though it's so much smaller than the cerebrum, it actually has just as many neurons as the cerebrum does. And that's able to happen because if you notice all of the little tiny folds that we see here in the cerebellum, it has way more gyri, or way more of these bumps, than the cerebrum does, which allows it to have extra space for having neurons. So if you're interested for unit number 3, current events in anatomy, there are actually some articles about a couple of individuals who it wasn't until they were in their 20s that they learned that they didn't actually have a cerebellum. So it's possible to function without a cerebellum, but it did lead to some motor delays. It led to some issues with the way that they walked or the way that they talked, but it's not fatal. We can survive without a cerebellum. So fun fact about the cerebellum. To talk about the other parts of the brain, I actually want to bump with you to this model. Can you confirm for me? I think it's on page 5. Is that accurate, that this model is on page 5 of your packet? Yes, I'm getting one yes at least. Okay, perfect. So let's work on labeling this together. We'll talk about some of the stuff that we already labeled, and we'll label a bunch of new stuff to talk through that's functions as well. So I'm going to go black here. We'll start with the lobes of the cerebrum that we already talked about. So this one that I have here in the very front is the frontal lobe. When we go here kind of to the back side, we get to the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. And down in the very back at the bottom, that occipital lobe of the cerebrum. In this view, we can't see the temporal lobe and we can't see the insula, so we don't have to label those things. Something very, very important that we must know is this white line right here, this thing labeled number 4. This thing labeled number 4 is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum. And I'm going to type its name in the chat. It's too long. Corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the white matter that attaches together the two cerebral hemispheres. So if you go to the very bottom of the longitudinal fissure, you can find this white matter, which is called the corpus callosum. Fun fact about the corpus callosum: while it allows the left side and the right side of the brain to communicate with each other, sometimes we actually cut the corpus callosum if a person has really bad seizures. So seizures can happen because the left side of the brain sends a different message than the right side of the brain sends, and the body can't process that there's two different messages coming at once. So sometimes we'll sever that connection, we'll chop the corpus callosum to stop those seizures. Down below the corpus callosum, there is another little white matter line that we see right here, so number 6. This is something called the fornix. The fornix. And the fornix helps us to send information into our memory center of the brain. The memory center of the brain is called the hippocampus. So the smaller white line, the fornix, the larger white line, the corpus callosum. Down below that white line, we get into a region of the brain that I think looks a lot like a duck face. So this region here, kind of in the middle of the brain, this is an area called the thalamus. The thalamus. And the thalamus is a sorting center. So when information comes up through your spinal cord, it goes out to the various parts of your brain, gets to the right place of your brain, because the thalamus sends it there. In the very middle of the thalamus, you can see number 8, that brown spot. That brown spot is something called the intermediate mass. The intermediate mass of the thalamus, and I'll type its whole name in the chat here. Intermediate mass of the thalamus. Think of the intermediate mass of the thalamus like the corpus callosum that we have in the cerebrum. So the intermediate mass, the eye on my duck, it connects the left side and the right side of the thalamus to each other. We also have this place that kind of looks like a bill on the duck. So imagine that we've got our little duck bill right here. This bill on our duck is an area called the hypothalamus. Remember that hypo means below, so the hypothalamus is below the thalamus in the brain, the hypothalamus. It controls a lot of your basic life functions, and the way that it does that is through using number 16 here. So number 16 is something that hangs down below the hypothalamus. This is called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland makes a whole lot of hormones for your body. So sex hormones, hormones that regulate things like hunger or thirst, your blood pressure. You'll talk a lot about the pituitary gland in AMP2. One other structure attached to the duck that I want to point out, and I drew on it a little bit, so let me erase. We're going to erase the duck face if I can get it. There we go. Okay. My thing right here, number 9. This is something called the pineal gland. The pineal gland, and I'll type its name in the chat. The pineal gland's claim to fame is that it makes melatonin. And melatonin is that sleepy time hormone that goes up when it's bedtime and should be going back down when it's time to wake up. So the pineal gland made or located in the back side of the thalamus, back behind the thalamus. Then we go down into the part of the brain that's called the brain stem. The brain stem is really important for basic life functions. So the things that keep you alive are thanks to the brain stem. So let's start with a kind of boring region right here. This boring region right here is called the midbrain. Honestly, the only thing we're having you know about the midbrain is that it's the location of some bumps that we're getting ready to talk about, the corpora quadrigemina. So the midbrain, not very exciting. It's where the thalamus meets some of the other structures. What's more exciting is here on the back, number 18. So number 18 down here, this is what's called the corpora quadrigemina. Corpora quadrigemina, and I'll type that as well. Corpora quadrigemina. This name literally means the four bodies or the four bumps. There's two on each side of the back of the midbrain. These are reflex centers in your brain. So if we were in class together, I could throw a textbook at you and you would move out of the way. That's because of a visual reflex. Or if I dropped that textbook on the ground and it made that thud and you jumped, that's an auditory reflex. So reflexes are all about keeping you alive. The corpora quadrigemina do those reflexes for us. Down below the midbrain, we've got this big bump that we see right here, number 20. This big bump that is number 20 is something called the pons. The pons has the pontine respiratory center, which helps us with the process of breathing. So keeping us breathing thanks to our pons. Also thanks to this area that's down below the pons. This area in here is called the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata, and I'll type that one as well. The medulla oblongata helps us with breathing. It helps us with our heart rate. It's also responsible for everyone's favorite reflexes, like coughing and sneezing and vomiting, everyone's personal favorite, right? So lots of reflexes that are controlled by the medulla oblongata. I believe the only things we have left to label are stuff on the cerebellum and then some of our connective tissues. So remember that this whole brown thing that we see here, all of that is the cerebellum, the brown part. And inside the cerebellum, the white matter that's inside of it was called the arbor vitae. So the white matter inside the cerebellum, the arbor vitae. When we look at the brain in the cross section, you can see this blue line that's here on top of the brain. We can see it all the way around here, this blue line. This blue line is something called the dural venous sinus. The dural venous sinus, and I'll type that one in. The dural venous sinus is the way that your brain gets rid of blood that doesn't have oxygen in it anymore. So the dural venous sinus filled with blood, draining oxygen-poor blood away from the brain. To explore that a little bit more, we're going to go back to this model that you have a picture of on the page before. Before we dive into this crazy looking model, I want to give you a couple of pictures that puts it in context, and then we'll label it together. So track with me here as I'm going to show you some pictures. I believe they're in the guided lesson as well, so you can go back and look at these pictures here. So far, we've labeled the brain in the way that if we had done a mid-sagittal cut and we cut it like that, that's how we labeled it. Well, now when we're looking at that model and we're looking at the pictures here, we actually did a coronal cut on this one. So we separated the front from the back. When I look inside the brain and I've separated the front from the back, notice that I can see these bumps. These are the gyri, and I can see these places where there's an indentation. That's a sulcus. So my brain is this bit dark beige stuff. That's the gray matter of the brain, and the white matter of the brain that's down next to it. To protect the brain, we put a bunch of connective tissue layers around it. So the first layer, this pink layer that I see directly attached to the brain, this is called the Pia Mater. The Pia Mater. Pia means gentle. So this thin, gentle layer that's touching the brain is called the Pia Mater. Above the Pia Mater, we have this seafoam green layer that we see right here that has all of these little extensions. So you can see these little lines hanging down from it. This layer is what we call the Arachnoid Mater. So the seafoam green is the Arachnoid Mater. And it got its name because if we look down at our picture down here, all those little stringy things in real life actually kind of look like spider webs. So the Arachnoid Mater has these little collagen strings that come down from it that make it kind of look like a spider web. So that's that middle layer of the meninges. And on the outside of that, this white layer that we see here, and it actually on this part splits in half. This outside layer is called the Dura Mater. So the outermost connective tissue layer, the thickest layer, is called the Dura Mater. And where the Dura Mater splits in half is that thing we were just looking at, the dural venous sinus. If I split apart the two layers of the dura, I can put blood in the middle, and that's what I see happening there. So now that we've looked at it on labeled pictures, let's go back to our model together and let's try to label these things together. So to give us a frame of reference, let's start here at the top. I'm adding some hair up here because this is where the skin would be. So this is the outside of your body. We've got our skin on the outside. Then underneath it, we've got a little bit of that adipose tissue. Adipose tissue, remember, part of the hypodermis. So I can see that adipose tissue, which is adding a little covering for me for my bone tissue that makes up the skull. The first layer of these connective tissues that I see underneath the bone was the really thick one, the one that we called the Dura Mater. The Dura Mater. Notice that the Dura Mater splits in half, like we talked about, and it leads to a space. Now in real life, that space isn't going to be empty. In real life, that space will be filled with blood. So I'm adding some blood to this space here. This space here is that thing called the dural venous sinus. Dural venous sinus. Yeah, Hannah's asking if we need to know these things. I'm probably not going to ask you adipose and bone, but I am going to ask you everything else. So make sure we know all of our layers, our spaces, that kind of stuff. But I'm probably not going to use a quiz or test question to ask you about adipose tissue. All right, so the space in between the layers of the dura, the dural venous sinus, then right down below the dura, we get into that spider web layer. So there's the Arachnoid Mater, with all of its little spider webs that are coming down off of it, the Arachnoid Mater. There's actually some space that's open underneath the Arachnoid Mater before we get to that thin Pia Mater layer that we see there. So the open space where those spider webs hang down, I can see it down here, I can see it here. All of this is called the subarachnoid space. I'll type that in the chat for us, the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is a fluid-filled space, but it doesn't have blood. The subarachnoid space has something called cerebrospinal fluid inside of it, or CSF for short, cerebrospinal fluid. That's something that circulates inside your brain and also around your brain on the outside. So the subarachnoid space underneath the arachnoid mater. Then we've got that Pia Mater, is that thin layer here on top of the cerebrum. A couple other things that are mentioned on your list that I'll point out just so we're aware of them. Remind me in the chat, when I talked about a gyrus, was a gyrus a bump or an indentation? That word gyrus, did it mean a bump or an indentation? Exactly. Several of us chiming in. A gyrus is a bump. So when I look at my model, this is where I find my brain. And see how I've got a bump that's sticking out right here. I've got a bump that's sticking out right here. I've got a bump right here. All of these are gyri. All of these are bumps. And see how I've got this indentation that goes down this direction? This would be an example of a sulcus, because a sulcus was an indentation. Again, to be fully transparent with you, I don't expect on the quiz or the exam that I would ask you about a gyrus or a sulcus, but just be aware that I can see those bumps and those indentations on this model as well. Yeah, so asking about the sulcus again, let me change colors and I'll color inside of it. This place where there's the indentation, where we go down in the brain tissue, that would be my sulcus. And my gyrus would be any of those bumps that we highlighted in black. So the sulcus in yellow, the gyrus in the black. So that brings us back to this model, because the one other, well, there's a couple other things for us to label on it. Really, probably the only one I'm actually going to ask you about is the white connective tissue that I see right here on the outside of the dural venous sinus. Do we remember which of our mater layers was the thickest layer? Was it my Pia Mater, my Arachnoid Mater, or my Dura Mater? Who is the thickest layer that I have in my meninges? Exactly. Yep. Several of us are chiming in. The dura is the thick layer. So what we see there in white is the Dura Mater. That's really the only layer of my meninges that I can see on this model, is that really thick white one, the Dura Mater. So I can see that on either side of the dural venous sinus, which is the blood vessel that's on top of the brain. I can also see, because we asked you to label it, but again, it's probably not what I'm going to ask you about on the exam, the fact that I can see that bone connective tissue up here as well. All of that's bone. So the bones of the skull, I can see that wrapping around the brain. What questions do we have? Or shoot me a thumbs up if you don't have any questions. Questions or thumbs up. Or another emoji. It doesn't have to be a thumbs up. If our mind is blown, that's okay. Yeah, Hugh is mind's blown. Thumbs up from Madison. All right, well, as you are studying this, if you come up with other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you with that. And remember, you can do the homework assignment as many times as you want to. So if you want to go in and just do the questions with this model, go for it. Or if you want to go in and just do the questions about the cerebellum, go for it. Yeah, so I got a clarifying question in the chat about where the cerebrum is. Can anyone kind of give me a description? What did we talk about the cerebrum being? Does anyone happen to remember? Or how would you describe where the cerebrum is? On the second model, so we're not talking about this model that the picture is here? Okay, so I'm getting it. I'm trying to decipher the chat. I love it that that Dusty mentioned that when we're talking about the cerebrum on this picture, we're seeing the part that looks like the intestines. I love that. That's 100% correct. All of this is the cerebrum that we see here. I am wondering if we're asking about on this model. Is this the model that we're asking about the cerebrum on, perhaps? Yes, okay. So the cerebrum is made up of the gyri and the sulci. So down here at the bottom, this is that cerebrum. This is the brain. So we've got the bumps and we've got the indentations in the cerebrum, in the brain tissue. Yeah, I love that, Dusty, how you equated it to look like the intestines. Totally right. I love that. Any other last minute questions about this brain stuff? I have to show you all. This brings me great joy right here. I love that there's a brain emoji in Microsoft Teams. So that's going to make my day for today. It's the little things, right? All right. With that, then we're going to wrap up the brain and we're going to move to bone markings and muscles of the skull. When we talk about bone markings of the skull, some of them we're already familiar with because in lesson number 6, we practiced with these kinds of things. So I'm going to highlight a few of them for you, not all of them, but we'll chat through several of them. I want to start by pointing out that I see 1, 2, and 3 bone markings that include the word foramen. Can you remind me in the chat what kind of bone marking was a foramen? We're talking about a foramen. Which of our groups of bone markings did that one fall into? Exactly. Yep. A few of us are starting to chime in here. When we talk about a foramen, that was an example of a hole. So when I look at the names of my foramina, the names of my holes, that gives me hints about where I find them. So for example, this hole that I have above the eye socket, this is called my supraorbital foramen. Supraorbital means above the eye socket, supraorbital foramen, the hole above my eye. Down below my eye, I have the infraorbital foramen. Infraorbital, because it's inferior or below the orbit. And down here in the very bottom, I've got a hole that's in the mandible. Remember that your chin was the mental region. So this one down here is called the mental foramen. So use the hints in the names of these bone markings, not only to tell you that, oh, I'm looking for a hole, but also, oh, I'm looking for a hole that's above the eye or below the eye, or that should be by the chin. We had one other kind of hole that we labeled when we were doing this in lesson number 6, and that's this thing right here. This thing right here is the external acoustic meatus, the outside hearing hole, external acoustic meatus. Next door to the external acoustic meatus, we have a couple of things that hang down. These things that hang down are both called processes. So my really big process, or my massive process, is called the mastoid process. It's so big, the mastoid process. And then this little one that hangs down here, that's called the styloid process. The styloid process, like a stylus that you'd use to write on your tablet. So the mastoid process, massive, very big. The styloid process, very skinny and pointy. We've got a couple of bone markings that come together to make up your cheekbone. So this region right here is part of your cheekbone, and this region right here is part of your cheekbone. Your cheekbone is actually made out of two different bones. So the front part of your cheekbone is this one that I see here in blue. That's the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone. The back one that I see here that's large is the temporal bone. So I've got two bones that come together with this thing that sticks out that makes your cheekbone. When I talk about the parts of these bones that stick out, the names of the bone markings on them relate to who they touch. So here's what I mean by that. Let me change colors here. This part right here, where my zygomatic bone attaches to my temporal bone, the very front of your cheekbone, this is something that's called the temporal process, lost my pointer, temporal process of the zygomatic bone. The temporal process where the zygomatic bone attaches to the temporal bone. Compare that to what we see on the back part of your cheekbone here. This is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So the name of the bone marking is opposite of the name of the bone. The zygomatic process is on the temporal bone. The temporal process is on the zygomatic bone. Make sure to keep in mind that those two are flip-flopped. Other bone markings I want to point out. I want to briefly chat about our sutures. Remind me, when I talk about sutures, these are joints that do or do not move. Sutures do or do not move. We're going way back to lesson 1 in lecture. Dusty votes do not. Anybody agree or disagree? Is anybody listening? Let's ask a different question. I'm afraid that at least 70% of us fell asleep. Is that accurate? Yes, that's accurate. Or we're listening, either way. All right, so when we talk about sutures, this was the kind of joint that we see in the adult skull, not in the fetal skull. So the fetal skull is where we had those things called fontanelles. The adult skull has sutures instead. So sutures are where two bones come together and they overlap. When we have a suture, we do not have a lot of movement at the site of the suture. The names of the sutures, my first one here that we're going to talk about, this one right here, this one lines up with the kind of plane that it looks like on your body. So if we were to cut your head like this, we'd be making a coronal plane, and this is called the coronal suture. The coronal suture. Next door to it, so dividing up the temporal bone from the parietal bone, this one's called the squamous suture because it's squiggly on the side, the squamous suture. And in the very back, we've got a suture called the lambdoid suture. The lambdoid suture. As you're studying the sutures, one of the best ways to study is just which two bones is it between? Is it between the frontal bone and the parietal bone? Is it between the parietal bone and the temporal bone? Or between the temporal bone and the occipital bone? If we can keep track who it's between, that's going to help us to label those sutures in a lot of different views. So let's go to a back view of the skull. We can see a back view of the skull over here. On the back side of the skull, you can see this big pointy thing that sticks out of the skull. This is called the external occipital protuberance. The external occipital protuberance. This is a big bump that's really important for muscle attachment, for muscles like the trapezius on the back side of your body, the external occipital protuberance. Next to it, we have what's called the superior nuchal line. Superior nuchal line. Again, that's another important bone marking for muscle attachment. We already talked about how this one back here, this was the lambdoid suture here in the back, the lambdoid suture. But we also have a new suture. Again, this is one that lines up with the names of my planes. If I chop my body in the middle, divided into left and right, that would be a mid-sagittal cut. So this is called the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture, because it divides in the same way that a sagittal plane would. We can also see a little bit over here on the side of that squamous suture as well. So a little bit of the squamous suture here too, squamous suture. When we look inside the skull, let me introduce you to one of the bones we haven't seen very much of yet. So this one right here, that looks kind of like a bat or a butterfly or whatever you want to call it. This bone here is the sphenoid bone. We can really see it best from this angle, the sphenoid bone. A few bone markings on the sphenoid bone. There's two holes that I see right here. These holes are called the optic canals, and I'll put that in the chat for us. Optic canals. This is the place where the nerves that go out to your eyeballs leave from the brain to go out there through the optic canals. Then we've got this space right here. This space right here is an indentation called the sella turcica. And if we looked at this from the side, what you'd actually see is a big divot. So here's that sella turcica. It's an indentation. I'll type its name in the chat, sella turcica. This is an indentation for the pituitary gland. So that thing that makes all kinds of hormones, it's so important to your body that we gave it its own little bone marking, its own little space inside the skull, the sella turcica. If we look in front of the sphenoid bone, notice that we can see all of these little spots that are up here. These are actually all holes. So these little spots or little holes that we're seeing here are called the cribriform foramina. I'll underline it. Cribriform foramina. These are little tiny holes that go from inside your skull down into your nose. It's a space for neurons to help you with the sense of smell. So we've got a couple of cranial nerves that lay right on top of the cribriform foramina, and they drop down little neurons into your nose to assist you with the process of smell. So all those little spots, the cribriform foramina. In between the cribriform foramina, so sticking up, is this little bar. So this is, imagine this is bone tissue sticking straight up. This is called the crista galli. The crista galli, and it helps to divide the left and the right sides from each other. So it's a bone projection that sticks straight up, dividing the left and the right side up there. The only other bone marking to know in this view here is this big one right here. This big one right here is called the foramen magnum. Literally the big hole, foramen magnum. Okay, let's take a guess If you were to guess what might be inside this hole, any ideas of what might be inside the foramen magnum, inside this big hole here? Exactly. The foramen magnum is the space where the spinal cord can attach to the brain. So we would have, if we're looking at our other view, we have our little vertebrae bones that are right underneath it, but we need a space, the foramen magnum, for that spinal cord to come out of the brain. So foramen magnum, the big hole that allows the spinal cord to attach to the brain. One more view of the skull for us to be familiar with. Let's start with what we just talked about. So we just talked about the big foramen magnum, the big hole. Next to the foramen magnum, you can see these two things. These are bumps, so they're things that stick out. These two things are called the occipital condyles. Remember that condyle was a projection word. So these are the occipital condyles. This is what allows you to rock your head forward and backwards when you're nodding yes, the occipital condyles. Back farther on the occipital bone, we've got our external occipital protuberance. External occipital protuberance. And next to that is the superior nuchal line. Superior nuchal line. We can also see, even though they're not sticking out in total 3D, if we look over here on the side, I can see my massive projection over here. That's the mastoid process. The mastoid process. And up in front of it is that smaller one that we call the styloid process. The styloid process. We also have an indentation right here. This is an indentation. And this indentation is called the mandibular fossa. So mandibular fossa. It's an indentation for the mandible to rest inside the temporal bone, allowing you to move your jaw, allowing you to talk. So it rotates back and forth in the mandibular fossa. And from this view, we can see very clearly that there are two parts to your cheekbone. So remember that since I'm here in the back, this is the temporal bone, which means it's got the zygomatic process on the temporal bone. And up in the front here, we've got the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. What questions do we have? Or shoot me some kind of emoji. What do we think? How are we feeling? Here's my emoji for you. Love it. Lots of bone markings of the skull this week. But the good news is we actually don't have too many muscles that we're learning this week, so that's going to help us out. So we've wrapped up our bone markings. Let's go into our muscles. When we are looking at the muscles, Shelby's excited. Woohoo! When we're looking at the muscles, many of these muscles are named based on the bones they're on top of. We already talked about this a couple weeks back, right? So here in the very front, we have that bone called, or that muscle called frontalis. So we can see frontalis in the forehead. Hey, frontalis is one of those muscles that we can paralyze with Botox. We were talking about Botox in class today, right? So one of the muscles that will paralyze with Botox is the frontalis muscle. Over on the side of frontalis, so number 8 over here, that's my temporalis muscle because it's on top of the temporal bone, temporalis muscle. Then we go back to around the eye. This muscle right here is my circle around the eye, which means it's an orbicularis. And this is my oculi, orbicularis oculi, the circle around the eye. We also see that over here, the circle around the eye, orbicularis oculi. But we also have a circle around the mouth. That's orbicularis oris. Orbicularis oris, the circle around the mouth. Also attached to the mouth is the muscle that I see right here. And I can see it as well right here, number 5. This is a muscle called zygomaticus major. Zygomaticus major, this is your smiling muscle. So it pulls the skin at the corner of your mouth up and backwards. That helps you to smile, zygomaticus major. And next to zygomaticus, this muscle that I see right here, hiding underneath the salivary gland, you can also see it right here. This is a muscle called the masseter. So the masseter is a muscle that I find kind of on the backside of the jaw. One of my students on Monday mentioned that the other word we can use for chewing something, we can call that mastication when you're chewing. So the masseter helps with mastication, helps with chewing. One other muscle for us to be familiar with this week, and that's the muscle called the Sternocleidomastoid. Remember that the Sternocleidomastoid's name told me all the places it attached. It attaches to the sternum, to the clavicle, and the mastoid process. So number 14 right here, all of this is that muscle called the sternocleidomastoid, number 11. And over here, I can see my sternum, my clavicle, heading up toward the mastoid process. There's my sternocleidomastoid. Can't remember if we said this a few weeks ago. The sternocleidomastoid is your whiplash muscle. So if you get whiplash, the reason it's so hard to move your neck is because this muscle that goes straight up and down in the neck give you some issues. Sternocleidomastoid. Because we only have this many muscles this week, we also don't have too many functions. So this would be a week where we could go ahead and make some flashcards with functions of our muscles. So let's go through and chat about what they do. When we talk about elevating the eyebrows, raising the eyebrows to wrinkle the forehead, that's the job of frontalis, the muscle that lives in your forehead, allows you to raise your eyebrows. If we're trying to close our eyes or close our eyelids, or if I'm trying to close my lips, closing things is best done by circular muscles. So help me out in the chat. If I'm talking about orbicularis oris, is oris going to close my eyes or my mouth? Orbicularis oris. Does that close the eyes or the mouth? Exactly. Yep. Orbicularis oris is the one that helps to close my mouth or close my lips. It's the circle one around the mouth. Orbicularis oculi is the circle one around the eyes, allowing us to close the eyes. We have 2 muscles that help us out with lifting up the mandible. One of them is the muscle that goes straight up and down on the corner of the mandible. That's called the masseter. So that one lifts it straight up and down. But the other one that helps us to elevate it or helps us to raise it is the temporalis muscle. So the temporalis muscle that's found on your temples, that also helps to elevate the mandible. But the other thing that temporalis can do is it can actually retract the mandible as well, which means we pull the jawbone backwards, allowing us to do that thing called an overbite, where your teeth in the top are farther out than your teeth in the back. So not very many functions that we're learning this week. We get a little break from that, but please make sure that we're memorizing these functions. And I'll mention to you, I can't remember if I said this or not, there are several review assignments for the lab final exam at the very bottom of our modules section. We have completed all of the content from that first review assignment. That was for packets 7 and 8. Please, each week starting now, please keep going back and doing those assignments just to keep that information fresh. The other kind of information we're going to want to keep fresh is the muscle movements and the bone markings. We've got homework assignments that review each of those things to get you ready for the lab final. So please start taking advantage of those, because remember, I don't care what low scores you get on our way there. By the time the assignment's due, get your 100%, get your 90%. But for now, use it to help you practice so that we're not forgetting all of our stuff about muscles. We're not forgetting all of our stuff about neurons. So lots and lots of practice, not only with the muscles, but with all the other content as well. One last thing I'm going to do with you before we go into our group work is I'm going to do our origin and insertion activity together. As we get ready to do the origin and the insertion activity, help me out in the chat. Is it the origin, O, or the insertion, I, that moves when a muscle contracts? Is it O or I, the origin or the insertion? Which one moves when a muscle contracts? Exactly. Yep, the one that's going to move when a muscle contracts is the places that are the insertions of a muscle. So when I'm talking about the muscle we're gonna do today is the sternocleidomastoid. It attaches to the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process. So we're going to use the information about what's its insertion and what's its origin to help us to predict movements. So since I have the green out, we're going to go ahead and do the insertion right now. The insertion of sternocleidomastoid is the mastoid process. That big thing that we labeled on our skulls, the mastoid process, that's a connection point for the sternocleidomastoid. Now I'm going to get my origin color out here. The origin is the manubrium of the sternum and the clavicle. Quick reminder for us that the manubrium is the top of the sternum, and then we had the body down below it, and we had that little xiphoid process at the very end. So my insertion for sternocleidomastoid, it attaches up here on the manubrium of the sternum. It attaches to the clavicle, next door neighbor. Now I'm going to connect the dots to build me the sternocleidomastoid. Now that I've built the sternocleidomastoid, I'm going to predict what's moving and how it's moving. So you can literally feel on yourself your mastoid process that sticks down from your skull. You can feel on yourself your sternum and your clavicle. We are taking the mastoid process that attaches to the sternum and the clavicle through the sternocleidomastoid. We're going to bring this toward this. When I bring them together, my head went anteriorly. It went toward the front. Do I call it flexion or extension when I move my skull toward these bones. When the angle between them gets smaller, is that F or E? Flexion or extension? When my bones get closer together. Exactly. When I bring things closer together, I do flexion. So when I contract, and I know you have two questions about movements here. We're talking right now about when I contract both sides. When I bring both of my mastoid processes toward my sternum and clavicle, I go forward. I do flexion of my skull. When I just do one of these and I pull these things together, when I just pull one, we actually go like this. We actually do rotation. So when only one sternocleidomastoid muscle contracts, we do rotation. When both of my sternocleidomastoid muscles contract, we do flexion. We pull the head forward. So in addition to the movements you were studying from the last page, we also need to make sure to study the flexion and extension, or just the flexion and the rotation of sternocleidomastoid. All right. Any questions that we have before we split up into our groups? I'll grab our group work here to put in the chat. How do we feel about this content compared to some of the other weeks? What do we think? Is this about as bad as normal? A little bit better than normal? What do we think? I guess we haven't started studying it yet, right? Yeah, a little bit better than normal. Yeah, there's still a lot of information for sure. The packet's not 15 pages, so that's a win. Yes, yeah, Hannah's mentioning it helps that we already know some stuff about the bones. Absolutely, yes. That was on purpose, which is why we made you learn them way back in week 1, so that by the time we get here to week 11, we have some working knowledge, so we're not starting from scratch. Yeah, Hugh, it's barely shorter. It's true, but every little bit helps, right? All right, I have put into the chat for us the link to the group activity. Remember that only one person in your group needs to submit your group's submission, but if you all want to go ahead and click on it so you have it up on your computer so that you can see it, once your group finishes your group activity, you are good to go for the day. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms, and when everyone's in a room, I'll make sure to post that link as well. So good luck on the group assignment. I'm going to be monitoring in the chat. Other than that, have a great afternoon, and I will see you in class next week.